In yesterday's programme, I discussed how there are now accumulating reports sourced from experienced journalists like John Helmer, but also to some extent confirmed by open materials like Shoigu's address to the Russian military leadership, an article that's appeared in Vzglyad by a Russian military journalist, Mr. Krutikov, all of which cumulatively suggest that the Russian military thinks that the process of aggressive attrition in the Ukrainian battlefronts is now achieving its objective, is now close to achieving its objective, that the Ukrainian forces are starting to suffer extremely heavy losses, or have been suffering extremely heavy losses, that their forces are now significantly reduced in number, that they're obliged to call up their last reserves, and that the point may soon come when the war comes to its tipping point, when Ukrainian defenses start to collapse, that a general unraveling takes place, and the Russians, who are building up enormous forces, will be in a position to launch an offensive that might finally end the war. Now, there might be some reasons to think this from Russian military reports, the Defense Ministry's reports. The Russian Defense Ministry, as it often does, has now provided us with an account of the fighting, or details about the fighting, in the zone of the special military operation over the last week. Now, I want to stress this is a Russian report. The Ukrainians would no doubt provide different information, and there are inevitably omissions from the information that the Defense Ministry is providing. They provided no information, for example, about whether a Nanuchka-class missile corvette, the Ivanets, has indeed been sunk by a Ukrainian waterborne drone in the Crimea area over the course of the last week. The Russian Defense Ministry says absolutely nothing on that point. What they do provide, however, is a sense of the scale of Ukrainian losses. And if you add up all the losses that the Russian Defense Ministry claims the Ukrainians suffered over the course of last week, it comes to 6,280 men killed or wounded. Now, it's important to stress once again that this figure is incomplete. The Russians have provided brief, very terse rundowns of the scale of losses experienced by the Ukrainian military on every part of the battlefronts, except arguably the most important, which is Avdeyevka. The Russian Defense Ministry has a policy of not discussing the situation in Avdeyevka or of giving details of Ukrainian losses in Avdeyevka. Given that the fighting in Avdeyevka has been the most intense of all over the last week, it is likely that we would need to upgrade the total of Ukrainian losses significantly from the 6,280 that the Russians are giving, if we were to guess the actual figure that the Russian Defense Ministry thinks is the figure representing Russian losses over the last week. A reasonable guess, perhaps another 1,500 to 2,000 men killed or wounded on the Ukrainian side in Avdeyevka over the last week, perhaps pushing up the total to around maybe 8,000 dead and wounded, which is what the Russian Defense Ministry calculates. That is a level of loss which is unsustainable for an army the size of Ukraine's, which the Russians estimate numbers around 450,000 men. I discussed that in a recent program. And to repeat again, the force that the Ukrainians have deployed on the battlefronts probably represents the maximum total that they can sustain in the war, given the present demographic problems in Ukraine, the reduction in the population, the fact that a large part of the Ukrainian population has now left the country, in some cases, specifically in order to avoid conscription. So that gives us a sense of the scale of the attrition that the Russians, of course, that the Russians think that they are inflicting upon the Ukrainians. Now, it may be that the Russians are overstating Ukrainian losses, but as I have discussed in previous programs, unofficial information from Ukrainian sources, on the contrary, appears to bear out Russian claims. In fact, they suggest that Russian calculations of Ukrainian losses might be on the conservative side. Now, I say informal information. We've had a number of interviews given by Ukrainian soldiers. There's been a rather appalling article. I say appalling because of what it describes in the French newspaper Le Figaro, again interviewing Ukrainian soldiers. They discuss again the very, very heavy losses that they are experiencing on the battlefronts, the fact that they are short of men and ammunition, that they're finding it increasingly difficult to keep the Russians back. And I believe there's another article, which I haven't read, somewhere else in the Western media, which basically says the same thing, again based on interviews given by Ukrainian soldiers. One of the most troubling one of these interviews is one in which a Ukrainian soldier says that in an average company, in his particular company, of the 100 men that were present in that company, there's only about 20 left, and the trenches are now occupied by the dead. The dead in the trenches now significantly outnumber the living, which is a really harrowing thing to have to read. And in fact, we're getting more and more reports from more and more sources in Ukraine, which do suggest that the situation is becoming increasingly desperate on the battlefronts, that the Ukrainian army is exhausted, the men are exhausted, the demoralization is increasing, and that the losses are exceptionally high as the Ukrainians now find themselves systematically outgunned by the Russians on every battlefront. And perhaps a further sign of the extent of demoralization within the Ukrainian military is provided by information the Russian Defense Ministry has given about the total number of surrenders by Ukrainian soldiers to the Russian military. They say that over the week, 26 Ukrainian servicemen surrendered. Now, that is a high total relative to the war. It is not a sign of disintegration. 26 men surrendering out of a military of 450,000 suggests that most Ukrainian soldiers are still willing to go on fighting, are still obeying orders, or at least trying to. There's been signs of disaffection and restlessness within the Ukrainian military, but most still seem to be prepared to keep battling. But nonetheless, it does seem as if there has been, over the course of the autumn and now going on into the winter, since the defeat of Ukraine's offensive of the summer, there does seem to be an uptick of Ukrainian surrenders, and that uptick apparently continues and might perhaps in time start to grow. In the meantime, the Russians continue to maintain their pressure. Returning to the topic of Ukrainian surrenders, there was a few days ago, as I've discussed, an exchange of prisoners between Russia and Ukraine. Each side handed over 195 men whom the Russians and the Ukrainians each held of each other's armies. And this elicited a comment from President Putin that the Russians hold 10 prisoners, 10 Ukrainian prisoners, for every Russian prisoner that the Ukrainians have. Now that is interesting, and that has led a number of people to start extrapolating total losses based on the fact that one would normally expect that there would be a ratio, a certain fixed ratio, between numbers of dead, numbers of wounded, and numbers of men taken prisoner. And it's been suggested that if the Russians indeed hold 10 Ukrainian prisoners for every one Russian prisoner that the Ukrainians hold, then the ratio of losses must be, well, perhaps not 10 to 1, 10 Ukrainian losses for every Russian, dead and wounded, that which is to say, for every Russian, but anywhere between 3 and 8, I've seen those numbers suggested. Well, that is possible, and I'm not going to speculate and take that too far. I think that 10 to 1 is undoubtedly an overstatement. If we were looking at a ratio of dead Ukrainians for dead Russians, well, Mediazona has given us numbers of around 40,000 dead Russian troops that it has been able to corroborate from open records. If the Ukrainians were suffering a ratio of losses of 10 to 1, if they had 10 dead Ukrainians for every one Russian, then that would mean that the Ukrainians had suffered 400,000 dead, which is far more than the Russian Defense Ministry is claiming. But nonetheless, it is likely that the Ukrainians have suffered. In fact, I think it is a certainty that the Ukrainians have suffered much heavier losses than the Russians, and probably by multiples. Now, on the topic of Mediazona, very briefly, I should say that the Mediazona keeps a careful track of the number of open source announcements of Russian deaths. And it's interesting that there was a significant fall over the course of the summer during the Ukrainian offensive when the Russians were on the defensive. The number then ticked up during the early days of Russia's offensive in Avdeyevka, but since then it seems to have trended down again. So despite the Russians being on the attack in most parts of the battlefronts, it seems from the Mediazona data that the losses that the Ukrainians are able to inflict upon them are actually if anything, trending downwards. And this is not difficult to explain. Most losses in war, especially this war, appear to be are caused by artillery fire. Now, there's been an awful lot of film and pictures of FPV drone attacks. Each side now regularly carries out FPV drone attacks on the other. I've spoken about how the Russians seem to be gradually getting on top of the business of jamming Ukrainian FPV drones. Putin, by the way, has spoken about this. There's been complaints, apparently, from Russian soldiers that they're having trouble with the Ukrainian FPV drones, and he's made comments to the effect that anti-drone equipment, jamming equipment, in other words, the amount of it needs to be accelerated and more of it needs to be provided to the troops. And we're probably going to see more of that over the next couple of weeks. But anyway, we've been hearing an awful lot about FPV drone strikes. But it's important to understand that when we get videos from each side showing FPV drone strikes by one side against the other, what they're showing us are the successful FPV drone strikes, almost by definition. And that does, I think, perhaps give us a distorted idea. Firstly, about how successful FPV drone strikes normally are, and also perhaps they give us a somewhat inflated sense of casualties, because of course what people do is that they assume that there are hundreds of these FPV drones operating across the battlefronts, and that each strike, each FPV drone strike is as effective as the ones we have videos of. There's no doubt that FPV drones are a major weapon now used in the war. We don't have exact numbers for the quantity of these drones that each side is deploying against the other. My sense is that Russian FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian forces are now multiples greater than those that the Ukrainians are able to launch. I've seen claims that the Ukrainians are able to launch almost as many FPV drone strikes on the Russians as the Russians launch against them. But I have to say, I think this is most unlikely. And I noticed too, by the way, that increasingly the Russians are launching FPV drone strikes now on Ukrainian logistical positions. There's film of FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian vehicles carrying supplies down the road to Ukrainian positions near Rabotino, for example. In other words, the Russians have enough FPV drones to attack vehicles on roads. They're not just using them to strike Ukrainian troops in combat positions. And they seem to be using FPV drones also to do damage and to demolish buildings in places like Bogdanovka, buildings which might not even be occupied by Ukrainian soldiers. So that gives me a sense that the Russians have no shortage of these drones and are using them on an increasingly widespread basis, probably outnumbering Ukrainian use of drones. But anyway, the point is that almost by definition, there's only going to be a number of successful FPV drone strikes on any particular day. Probably no more than you can count from the Ukrainian side, for example, against the Russian, and perhaps also vice versa, in terms of combat troops on each side who get hit by FPV drones and killed or wounded. By contrast, one is not going to get similar pictures about artillery strikes from one side against the other. We're not going to see the same vivid detail of pictures of the damage, of the deaths or woundings carried out by an individual shell or a barrage of shells as it hits a particular enemy position. And of course, there are thousands of rounds of shells being fired by each side against the other, except we now have an accumulation of information that Ukraine's ability to keep firing shells at the Russians is falling. Some put it at 2,000 rounds a day, some put it even less than that, whereas the number of shells that the Russians can launch against the Ukrainians appears to be increasing again. Some figures claim it's 10,000 rounds a day, others 20,000 rounds. I'm not going to try and guess. But anyway, one way or the other, the Russians are able to launch many more shells against the Ukrainians. And given that, as I said, it is artillery that inflicts the greatest number of casualties. That undoubtedly explains, to my mind, why, given the reducing number of shells that the Ukrainians are launching against the Russians, Russian losses are actually falling. It probably also explains why injuries by Russian soldiers are, according to data published by the Russian Defense Ministry, becoming less effective on Russian soldiers. The Russian Defense Ministry said that in 2023, only 0.5% of Russian soldiers who got wounded on the battlefronts were unable to rejoin their regiments. In other words, that they were unable to achieve a full recovery. And in 2024, currently, that proportion has fallen slightly to 0.45%. And the reason, again, clearly, is that fewer of these, that there's less Ukrainian artillery, and the result is fewer Russian soldiers are getting injured, and when they're sent to hospital, more of those that are sent to hospital recover from their injuries. So, that's, of course, Russian figures. The Russians do say that their medical staff, their casualty hospitals are working extremely efficiently, and that this is steadily improving, and which is probably true. But anyway, it does give us again a sense of the actual balance of what's going on in the artillery war. Anyway, where are we on the battlefronts today? Before I discuss this, I think it might be worth again looking at where the heaviest losses the Ukrainians have suffered over the past week, looking at the places where it is that those heaviest losses have occurred. So in the Kupiansk direction, which, by the way, also includes places like Avdeyevka, and where the Russians have been building a bridgehead as they seem to be working towards an advance on the Oskol River, towards the Oskol River. We much talk about major Russian advances in Kupiansk. Well, there the Russians say that the Ukrainians lost 750 men, dead and wounded, 1 tank, 9 armoured vehicles, 21 motor vehicles, and 8 field artillery pieces. Compare that with the level of losses that the Ukrainians have suffered further south in the Liman area. There, the Russians say that the Ukrainians lost 1,825 men, dead and wounded, 6 tanks, and 13 armoured vehicles, 36 motor vehicles, and 6 artillery pieces. And this is precisely the area where the Russians seem to be pushing towards the Zherebets River, and it's, I think, widely accepted that the Russian advance towards the Zherebets River, towards towns, small towns like Yampol and Tyorny, is now becoming irresistible, and it's also accepted that if the Russians do reach the Zherebets River, it's going to be impossible for the Ukrainians to maintain their defenses there, and we could actually start to see a Ukrainian collapse, or at least a major withdrawal of Ukrainian troops to the west bank of the Zherebets River and perhaps even beyond. So a major Ukrainian collapse in this area, the Liman area, and as we see, very, very heavy losses that the Ukrainians are suffering in precisely this area. And then we get information from the Russians about what is happening in the Bakhmut and Marinka areas. The Russians are lumping these two together, and they tell us that in this area, the Ukrainians lost 2,245 troops, 5 tanks, 19 armored vehicles, 63 motor vehicles, a whopping 28 field artillery pieces, and 2 Grad multiple launch rocket systems. So here the attacks, Russian advances, have been particularly heavy, but note that the Russians are combining Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut and in Marinka, which suggests that over the last week, the main Russian emphasis has been in the Liman area, and that it is in the Liman area that the Ukrainians have suffered the heaviest losses, apart possibly from Avdeyevka. And here, perhaps the most dramatic news has been happening not so much in the Bakhmut area, where the Russians, for the moment, seem to be focusing on drone and artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions in Bogdanovka and in the fields to the south of Bogdanovka, and also clearing and hitting Ukrainian positions, again with drone and artillery strikes around Ivanyivska. There's some suggestions that the Russians are now in the process of storming that particular village, but there's been little information about that. But the main weight of the fighting is not so much in the Bakhmut area. That's been put to some extent by the Russians on hold over the last week, that the Russians, on the contrary, have been emphasizing more attacks in the Marinka area, that they've been pushing very hard there. Now, in another report, we also have further information from the Russians, and again, rather complicated way, they're combining Ukrainian losses in the southern part of the Marinka area, Novomikhailivka, and with the fighting that's going on in the Bremivka salient. They say that there are 735 Ukrainian troops, 2 tanks, and 6 armored fighting vehicles have been lost by Ukraine. It seems that the Russians are pushing hard towards Novomikhailivka. The Russians have also but this is the part of the Marinka front which they place together with the Bakhmut forces. They're pushing forward in Avdeyevka, and they now seem to be making further advances around Novomikhailivka. This village of Novomikhailivka, increasingly taken into not just a semicircle, but apparently it's close to being surrounded. And it's been suggested that the Ukrainians before long will have to pull their troops out of Novomikhailivka, in which case that will allegedly put the Russians in a position where they can cut one of the key supply roads to Vuhledar, to finish completely the Battle of Vuhledar, to cut the supplies to Vuhledar entirely. As I understand it, the Russians would have to push further on towards Kurahovo, west of Georgievka, at which point it's likely that the defences in Vuhledar would finally collapse. But anyway, we can see that there's been quite intense fighting in this area. And lastly, Zaporozhye region, the Russians say this is the area of the Bradley Square. There's been a significant uptick in fighting there over the last week. The Russians say that the Ukrainians lost 385 men, dead and wounded, 1 tank, 9 armoured vehicles, 19 motor vehicles, and 15 artillery pieces, and 1 Grad multiple launch rocket system, as the Russians gradually work their way towards clearing Ukrainian troops from Bradley Square, from Rabotino, and those sort of areas. And lastly, 290 Ukrainian troops killed and wounded in Kherson region, some of them no doubt in the Krinky bridgehead, but also probably mostly through Russian bombing and missile attacks on Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper River. So that gives us a sense of where the major fighting is now taking place. The Liman area is a major focus of Russian attacks. We're told that in the Liman area, and by the way also in the Kupiansk area, Ukrainian defenses are rather disorganized. The Ukrainians are suffering very heavy losses there. And the Russians also are pushing very hard in the Bakhmut areas, still shelling and bombing and launching drone attacks on Ukrainian positions, but also in the Marinka area, where one senses that before very long, perhaps after the Battle of Avdeyevka is completed, we are going to see a major Russian focus on clearing Ukrainian defenses in the Marinka area and finally resolving the long-standing problem for the Russians represented by Ukrainian control of Vuhledar. The biggest battle of all, as I said, the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't talk about, and that is the Battle of Avdeyevka. Now, we've had a further cascade of reports over the course of the last 24 hours, and all of them speak of a very bad situation for the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka. Now, the first thing to say is that there's now video confirmation that there are still some Ukrainian troops in the northern part of the air defense base, which many, myself included, had assumed that the Russians had fully cleared after they were able to roll up Ukrainian defenses in the Tsar's hunting lodge. There were reports that Ukrainian troops had withdrawn en masse from the air defense base and that the Russians had occupied the base in its entirety. The Russians do, it seems to me, almost certainly control the greater part of this base, but it does appear as if there are some Ukrainian troops in some buildings in the northern part of this base. As Dima at the Military Summary Channel has, I am sure, correctly said, the fact that these Ukrainian troops are still there in the northern part of this base is not a good thing for the Ukrainians. What it means almost certainly is that some Ukrainian troops were unable to retreat from the base and are now all but cut off. And that's presumably why they're still resisting. And this probably also is true of another fortified position to the north of the air defense base, a rather complex structure, the nature of which I do not understand, which the Russians refer to as Cheburasha, which is, by the way, a well-known cartoon character from the Soviet era. It's a sort of strange-looking, at least the graphics of it suggest a strange and rather complex structure there. Anyway, there are Ukrainian troops in this place, Cheburasha, and in the northern part of the air defense base still, but as Dima correctly points out, they are surrounded on three sides by the Russians, and the Russians seem to have at least fire control of the main supply road into this area from the north, and in fact they're very close to that road, which must make it very, very difficult for the Ukrainians either to retreat from this position or to receive supplies. So it's likely that in practice these troops are surrounded. And furthermore, we've been hearing about Russian advances, the Russians gradually tightening the ring around these troops over the last couple of days, and it's likely that at some point over the next couple of days we will learn that this entire area has been cleared and that Ukrainian defenses have collapsed there. There's also multiple reports of significant Russian advances over the last couple of hours, further east, in the eastern areas to the east of Avdeyevka. The Russians now seem to be working towards surrounding Ukrainian troops in what is referred to as the filtration plant, another defense position. There's reports that the Russians have cut the main road, the N20 road. They've actually managed to occupy part of this road, cutting supplies to the troops in the filtration plant. It's difficult to believe that the Ukrainians have enough resources to be able to push the Russians back from these positions that they're now capturing. They've not been able to push the Russians back from the areas of southern Avdeyevka that the Russians have captured, nor it seems that they've been able to push the Russians back from the areas that the Russians have captured in northern Avdeyevka, which has brought them very close to, or rather, in effect, on the edge of the central areas of Avdeyevka. And now, following the likely collapse of Ukrainian defenses in the filtration plant, it's likely that the Russians will have another territory near Avdeyevka under control, and that they will be able to attack Ukrainian positions in Avdeyevka from the northeast. So advances from the northwest, from the northeast, from the south, and from the southwest, from the area of the air base and Cheburasha, when these all come under Russian control. And this, so far as I can understand, seems to track very closely what Mikael Valtersen, the Swedish military officer who writes very, very informative reports on the battlefields on Twitter X. Anyway, this is what Valtersen 2 days ago said that he thought the Russian plan for Avdeyevka would be. And he puts it like this: what's going to happen around Avdeyevka city the coming weeks? I don't believe the actual storming of the city will start, but the Russian army will try to secure their flanks and move into better positions before the actual storming. In the north, Russia has had significant success the last days in the red shaded data areas. That's the advance from the northwest, which has brought the Russians almost right up to the central blocks of Avdeyevka. This is a very important advance. Now the Russian army has secured an easily defendable western flank in the newly captured area, and as importantly reached the lake. The lake seems to be somewhere to the east of Avdeyevka. Last week, Russian forces also got to the eastern shore of the lake. This means that Russian troops are very close to encircling any Ukrainian troops in the contested area north of the lake. This is the sort of, as I understand it, this is the filtration plant, and we see that this is exactly what is happening. There are probably a couple of Ukrainian companies in this area. In other words, several hundred men. Ukraine has only two alternatives. Either they counterattack and try to retake the Dacha area, or they abandon the entire area north of the lake. When the Russian northern front is secured and they have good defensive positions, in other words, when the Russians have fully consolidated the positions they've captured and cleared all these Ukrainian defensives, they can focus on eliminating the remaining Ukrainian stronghold in the northeast by attacking south of it simultaneously from the west and east. The aim is to threaten the supply road to the stronghold, thereby forcing Ukrainian troops to retreat towards Avdeyevka city and giving Russians control of the northeast. And we've seen that that's exactly what appears to have happened. The Russians have now cut the N20 highway, which is, I think, what he is referring to. Anyway, he then goes on to say, in the south, Russian troops have taken control of some tree lines to the west of the former air defense base, securing the Russian western flank of the base. The next Russian goals are to eliminate the two Ukrainian strongholds north of the base and west of the recently captured Tsar's Hunting Lodge salient. We can see how that does seem to be in the process of happening. Russian troops can attack these strongholds from several sides. When they and the surrounding area are captured, the western flank of the slim Tsar's Hunting Lodge salient is secured, and the salient isn't slim anymore. At the same time, Russian troops will probably clear the woods between the Tsar's Hunting Lodge salient and the industrial zone. This is the area to the east of this area that the Russians now control in the southern suburbs and built-up areas of Avdeyevka. This will secure the eastern flank of the Tsar's Hunting Lodge salient and put Russian forces at the city border along a long stretch. After the conquest of the two strongholds, the Russians will use that to clear the fields to the west by advancing through the forest lines between the fields, getting closer to the last Ukrainian stronghold south of the district of Khimik, which is also called the citadel of Avdeyevka. Khimik is a built-up area on the south central part of Avdeyevka. There are now Russian forces already overlooking it. From the west, it is, as I said, an area of high-rise buildings. It's been very heavily bombed by the Russians, but it is expected to be the major fortified area of the main defense point of the Ukrainians in Avdiivka itself. And then Valterson concludes by saying with these rather obvious operations, the Russian military will be in a much better position to continue with the actual storming of Avdiivka city. So he is saying that there will be a major Russian attack on Avdiivka only once all of these areas around Avdiivka, the air defense base, the Cheburasha complex, the filtration plant, the fields between the filtration plant and the other Russian positions. Once all of these positions have been captured, and we see that we're now very, very close to that point indeed, and then the Russians will be able to roll up the whole of southern Avdiivka and without too much difficulty. And then the main battle for the citadel area, the area of high-rise buildings in the centre, will begin, and that will be no doubt a tough battle. But then, of course, we had something similar happen, as I recall, in Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians were pushed towards the western suburbs of Bakhmut by the Wagner forces, took up positions in various high-rise buildings. There was a bitter battle for the capture of these high-rise buildings. The Russians deployed T-80 tanks to basically shell, do massive damage to Ukrainian positions in those buildings, and that eventually allowed the Russians to storm these buildings and to bring the Battle of Bakhmut to an end. And I suspect we're going to see something very similar in Avdiivka as well. Meanwhile, we continue to get no reports at all about what's going on in the Stepovoye area, Stepovoye Berdichi area to the north. As I said, it's clear to me now that this was a pinning operation. It also was an operation which confused the Ukrainians. They thought that the main attack that the Russians would launch would come there, that the Russians would try some big, ambitious cauldron operation in Avdiivka. Instead, it's clear that, as happened in Bakhmut, the real Russian plan, almost certainly from the outset, was to storm Avdiivka from the south and east and north, and that is exactly what the Russians are doing. So a major battle, and the Russians are achieving significant progress and almost certainly exacting very, very heavy losses on the Ukrainians every day in Avdiivka, whose eventual fall, is inevitable. Valterson is not giving a timeline, but perhaps a month of further fighting, perhaps the end of February, the beginning of March, before Avdiivka finally falls. That might be a reasonable guess of how the battle for Avdiivka is going. Anyway, I get a rather detailed picture of the situation on the battlefronts today, but the overall story remains one of aggressive attrition. Ukraine suffering extremely heavy losses, perhaps 8,000 men lost over the course of the last week, and it's likely that this level of losses will continue, and with Ukrainian resources overstretched and running thin, it's going to be, I think, extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to be able to continue their defenses, to preserve their defenses. And it is not impossible that both in Avdeyevka and in the Liman area, where the Russians are now pushing very hard, we might see at some point over the next few weeks a sudden Ukrainian collapse. Anyway, that's my summary of the situation on the battlefronts, leaning very heavily on reports from the military summary channel from Valterson and to some extent from Slavyangrad, though I ought to say they appear to be in the process of reorganizing that indispensable Telegram channel. So they've been providing fewer updates recently, but I hope that invaluable updates will resume soon. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine, and with Ukrainian soldiers becoming ever more desperate and complaining to places like Le Figaro about the scale of losses and the fact that they're short of artillery. With the Russians, by contrast, sounding increasingly confident, as Putin is. I discussed yesterday his visit to Tula, his meeting with the people of the military-industrial complex there, and of course we had that very confident address from Shoigu to the military leadership, which I've also discussed, and we've had the commentaries from Helmer and Krutikov about the Russians sensing that a tipping point in the war might be coming, and that a Ukrainian collapse, well, no one is saying that it's imminent. Nobody is saying it's going to happen within the next few days or weeks, but it's starting to appear over the horizon. Now, what about the political news? Well, there's been a number of events that have happened, politically speaking, and I would say that cumulatively, they all suggest bad news for Ukraine. The first thing to say is that the political crisis in Kiev continues unabated. We were told last week that President Zelensky had finally decided to sack General Zaluzhny. In fact, there is no doubt about this at all. The US media says that Zelensky actually informed the Americans that he had made a decision to sack Zaluzhny. We were told that he would be sacked at the latest by Friday. Today is Sunday. Zaluzhny is still there. Apparently nobody's willing to take his place. The military have closed ranks behind him, and Zelensky has proved unable to sack him, which suggests that Zelensky is now losing control of the situation in Kiev, which makes it likely that his position in Ukraine, at the leadership of Ukraine, is now becoming increasingly fragile, and that the person who's more likely to be ousted at some point over the next few weeks is not Zaluzhny, but Zelensky himself. There's been an interesting tweet, by the way, from Kim.com, and I suspect he's taking this from various sources, that neither Nuland nor the CIA are prepared to support, are able to help Zelensky in this situation, that the hardline nationalist faction that is becoming increasingly ascendant in Ukrainian politics is closing ranks also behind Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny has long-standing connections with these people. Again, I think this view that has become very prevalent in the West, that Zaluzhny is some kind of political moderate, is completely wrong, in my opinion. Everything about Zaluzhny suggests that he is a completely committed supporter of the maximalist goals of the Maidan movement, and that he has strong relations with the hardline nationalist militias, who he appears to have supported and reinforced during his period as chief of Ukraine's general staff. Indeed, there's even a photograph which is now floating around, which appears to show Zaluzhny over the last couple of days, since the reports of his dismissal first began to circulate. They show Zaluzhny sitting apparently next to a top official of the right sector group, which is one of the most hardline groups on the nationalist side of politics in Ukraine. I'm not sure whether this is Dmitry Yarosh, who is the former head of the right sector organization, and who is said to be an advisor now in the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, but perhaps it was. Anyway, it seems to me that what we have seen over the course of the last week is that even as the situation on the battlefields is deteriorating, politically, Zaluzhny is in a stronger position than Zelensky, because he has the backing both of the senior military commanders, and because he has the backing of the nationalist militias, who continue to show deep skepticism towards Zelensky. Now, as I said, this is a bad news for Ukraine. It suggests continued political disaffection in Ukraine, division in Ukraine, at least for the next couple of weeks, organizing a coup against Zelensky, a straightforward unconstitutional removal of Zelensky from power, I suspect would be unacceptable to the United States and to the other Western powers. It is more likely that what we will see is a rapid erosion of Zelensky's position, leading to perhaps his forced exit when his constitutional term ends in March. But given his failure to get Zaluzhny sacked, Zelensky's position looks extremely brittle. Also, it seems to me. Meanwhile, the European Union had a meeting to discuss further assistance to Ukraine. There was no decision made about providing Ukraine with further assistance. And in Congress, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, appears to remain as hostile to continued funding for Ukraine as ever. Attempts to patch up some kind of a deal in the Senate appear to be deeply unwelcome to him. He said that the proposed plan would stand no chance in the House of Representatives. And I suspect, by the way, that a significant number of Republican senators will vote against this plan when Chuck Schumer does finally put it before the Senate. And Mike Johnson has now moved forward, and he's proposed that the House vote on aid for Israel as a standalone measure, separating this issue from funding for Ukraine, something which the Biden administration has consistently opposed, and which actually probably makes it likely that funding for Ukraine is less likely to come. So, not good news for Ukraine there either. And perhaps because these funding issues are accumulating, the ability to provide funding for Ukraine's military effort is intensifying. And of course, in the case of the United States, the failure to provide funding for Ukraine's economy as well. Anyway, perhaps because of all of that, there's been renewed talk about seizing Russian reserves. And we now have a new cunning plan. This time it apparently originates from the Belgian government. The plan is a variant of an earlier plan for Ukraine to issue bonds with secured against Russian assets, frozen assets, which would serve as collateral. Now the plan, on the contrary, is for the G7 states to issue bonds to support Ukraine, treating the frozen Russian assets as collateral. And supposedly the idea is that when the bonds become due, the Western powers will demand that the Russians pay up the amount of the money of the bonds, and if they refuse to do so, then the assets will be seized. Let me say straight away, this is another scheme, and again, it runs into the fundamental problem because it acknowledges that the assets, the frozen assets, belong to a third party, specifically Russia. And as I've discussed in previous programs, if you use someone else's property without their permission in order to advance your own objectives with the intention ultimately of seizing that property and depriving the third party of what is their property, well, that fulfills exactly the British definition of theft as set out in Section 1 of the Theft Act 1968. So this is just another scheme, a roundabout scheme, for stealing the Russian assets. And as I said before, when I discussed the idea of the Ukrainian bonds, in a kind of way, from a legal point of view, this seems to me worse than simply making the decision to seize the bonds, to seize the assets outright, because you are in effect admitting that these assets actually belong to Russia, that they are in effect Russian property, and yet despite admitting that they are Russian property, you are nonetheless misusing them. Anyway, all of this is very interesting. We will see what the West does. I gather that the British and the Americans are absolutely determined to seize these assets in some way. The European Central Bank is strongly opposed, unsurprisingly. Most of these assets are on European territory. The German and French governments are extremely unhappy about this idea. I suspect that the Bundesbank, which is of course a major shareholder in the European Central Bank, is every bit as opposed to this disastrous idea as the European Central Bank is. But the story of the Ukraine crisis is that eventually the Germans and the French buckle and agree to whatever it is, whatever crazy scheme the Anglo-Americans come up with. And the result has been absolutely calamitous for Germany and for Europe. The Germans have lost their access to cheap Russian energy. They're now in the process of deindustrialization. Their economy is contracting. There is no sign of this coming to an end any time in the future. There's no obvious solution to this problem. And yet, despite the Germans, who are the main decision makers here, despite the Germans having suffered one blow after another as a result of their decision, the Scholz government's decision to clamber on to the Anglo-American bandwagon, I suspect that they will buckle again. And they will once more agree to do something that deep down they know to be wrong, and which the relevant experts at the European Central Bank and the Bundesbank are telling them is wrong. The key thing to understand is that if they do that, the Germans and the French are once again weakening Europe's underlying position, its reputation for financial stability and security, to support a collapsing enterprise, because none of this funding is going to change the outcome on the battlefronts. And we have had further news which illustrates the true nature of the problem. This time last year, in advance of the Ukrainian offensive in the summer, the European Union promised Ukraine that the Europeans would supply Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells. 1 million artillery shells. And at the time, I said that I suspected that the intention was to flood Ukraine with these shells in advance of the offensive to enable the offensive to be carried out. Well, the European Union was unable to provide Ukraine with 1 million shells on the eve of the offensive. The United States, which had run out of shells, was not in a position to do so either. The United States went to South Korea. They persuaded the South Koreans to part with 500,000 shells, and with supplies from the European Union and the United States, and with drawdowns of shells from Israel, and some shells also apparently being provided by Pakistan. Ukraine was eventually provided with roughly 1 million shells, and it used those shells to conduct the offensive. But of course the offensive was a failure, and Ukraine ran out of shells basically by mid-August, forcing the United States to supplement the shells that Ukraine had with cluster munitions. But anyway, the story is the European Union failed to provide Ukraine with 1 million shells. And a couple of weeks ago, there was talk that the European Union was going to provide Ukraine with 1 million shells. It would continue to supply Ukraine with 1 million shells, and that this would take longer than previously expected. And then we were told that it was actually only going to be able to provide Ukraine with 600,000 shells, not the 1 million that had been promised. And I've now seen a further report which says that the total number of shells that the European Union is actually going to provide Ukraine is going to be only just over 500,000 shells. So the European Union has only been able to fulfill half of its promise to supply Ukraine with shells. And the United States is now also having problems producing shells. And I believe it was President Zelensky himself who recently admitted that there is not enough shell production in the entire free world, as he called it. the Western world, in other words, to meet Ukraine's need for shells. How is seizing Russian reserves, violating international law in the most fundamental way, calling into question the financial credit of Europe, and indeed beyond that, of the whole collective West, at a time when the Russians and the other BRIC states are moving towards setting up alternative trade and currency mechanisms? How is that going to change the problem with shells? And it is, most importantly, it is the lack of shells that is Ukraine's principal problem on the battlefields, together with the lack of men. But nonetheless, it looks as if that is what the Europeans and the Americans are going to do. They're going to seize these assets. They're going to come up with a scheme which is simply going to highlight in legal terms the illegality of the whole enterprise. And they're going to do that despite the fact that it will make no difference. Well, we have a problem. No funding, no supplies of weapons to Ukraine at the moment, even as the situation on the battlefronts deteriorates and the Russians are starting to think that the time is coming for a big offensive. And we've got, perhaps not coincidentally, reports of a further plan. Now, we need to be very cautious about this story because it comes from Novosti, the Russian news agency. So I'm not sure that this is real. In fact, I'm confident that it is not. But according to Novosti, there is a British plan floating around for an expeditionary force, a NATO expeditionary force, to be sent to Ukraine once the Ukrainian collapse on the east of the Dnieper happens, which supposedly the British think will be sometime around May. The idea is that a force will be sent by NATO into Ukraine to try to secure the West Bank of the Dnieper, to prevent further Russian advances beyond the Dnieper, and to save, in other words, what's left of Ukraine. It's acknowledged that all the territory east of the Dnieper is going to be irretrievably lost, but NATO will enter the war and try to secure the west bank of the Dnieper, central and western Ukraine, and this expeditionary force supposedly is going to be backed by a declaration of a no-fly zone. Now, I am deeply skeptical about the truth of this report. It seems to me that this is perhaps another example, an actual example of the Russians, because I said this is sourced from Russian media. All the reports about this plan come from Novosti. This looks to me like the Russians creating issues, floating the possibility of this plan, which may not exist. I have seen not a single report about it anywhere in the British media itself. But if we come back to the state of the British military, there is now a report from the British House of Commons Defence Committee, and it says that Britain's hollowed out armed forces are not ready to fight Russia. This is coming from the British Parliament. And we read from the Daily Telegraph that Britain's increasingly overstretched armed forces are not ready for a war with Russia. In a stark report, MPs said that the armed forces require more funding to engage in operations whilst also developing war-fighting readiness. And amid increasing pressure on defence spending, the committee discovered that $1.9 billion pounds of funding awarded in the budget last spring may now be used to plug shortfalls in defence rather than replenish and boost stockpiles. And we're told that the situation is absolutely critical, and the UK armed forces are deployed above their capability in response to the worsening security situation, but all have capability shortfalls and stockpile shortages and are losing personnel faster than they can recruit them. Does that suggest a military capable of participating in a NATO expeditionary force to be sent to Ukraine by May? Hardly, I would have thought. And the German military is said to be in an even worse condition, and the French military is perhaps in a slightly better condition, but not by much, and the American military is now tied up in a conflict of its own in the Middle East. So we have multiple problems building up in security terms. I've heard that the Royal Air Force, only half of its aircraft are in a flyable condition, and that there aren't even enough pilots to fly those aircraft that can be flown. Is anybody seriously think that a military like this is in a position to take on the Russians, who are getting stronger, as I've discussed, in many programs by the day? Does anybody seriously believe that Mike Johnson and Republican members of Congress are going to sit back happily and rubber stamp deployment of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, lightly equipped troops as these are, to Ukraine, and commit the US Air Force, currently conducting a pointless air campaign in the Middle East, to supporting a no-fly zone against the Russian Air Force, which is increasing in scale and efficiency every day, taking on the most powerful air defense system in the world? I hardly think so. And if we're talking about missiles, lots of talk a short time ago about the West supplying Ukraine with more long-range missiles to strike at Russia. The Russian Defense Ministry says that the Russians shot down 20 Western, in other words, British and French Storm Shadow Scalp missiles in just 1 week, which is last week. They shot down 20 of these. The United States is said to have a stockpile of 4,300 Tomahawk cruise missiles. That is around 60% of the number of cruise missiles that Russia has launched against Ukraine over the course of the special military operation. The United States apparently has production issues in producing Tomahawk cruise missiles. Is the United States in a position to deploy cruise missiles in sufficient number to Ukraine against the world's most elaborate air defense system in order to strike at Russia? And of course, bear in mind that most, or rather a very high proportion, of Russian military production takes place in the Urals and beyond, way beyond the reach of any cruise missiles that Ukraine could conceivably launch. And I'm not even going to start debating the risks involved in cruise missile strikes by Ukraine or NATO against Russia. I mean, we really would be in World War III territory if all of that were going to happen. So all of these far-fetched, elaborate, cunning plans, they seem to me to be collectively unworkable. And can I also quickly say that that makes, again, this whole cunning scheme of seizing these assets, these frozen Russian assets, to my way of thinking, even more absurd. It looks to me more like a childish tantrum than anything else, but that apparently is what the West is reduced to. Anyway, there we are. Bad news for Ukraine on the battlefronts. Avdeyevka, the Battle of Avdeyevka, now probably beyond its decisive point. It's clear that Avdeyevka is falling. An unresolved political crisis in Kiev, severe manpower and weapons shortages on the Ukrainian side, which the Ukrainians cannot change, and an increasingly powerful Russian army. Meanwhile, the United States, looking to me increasingly bogged down in a bombing war in the Middle East, in respect of which I think one of the most intelligent comments has been made by the commentator Elijah Magnier. He said this on Twitter. He says that the US, we don't want to escalate the war in the Middle East, but we're bombing Yemen and killing Yemenis. We've bombed Syria and Iraq and are killing Iraqis and Syrians. But please de-escalate. This is the other side, because we will bomb you more in the coming days. In the meantime, we're continuing to send Israel bombs to Israel so that it can continue bombing Gaza. And we've now had some astonishing comments from Israeli officials. They're showing no interest or concern in the decisions in the ICJ or the worries about from the United States. We've had comments at a rally from Ben Gvir. He says, if we don't want another 7th October, we need to go back home and control Gaza. In other words, take over complete control of Gaza. We need to find a legal way to voluntarily emigrate Palestinians and impose death sentences on terrorists. In other words, remove the entire Palestinian population from Gaza. And we have Finance Minister Smotrich saying we're rising. We have a nation of lions. And we have Chaim Katz, who is another Israeli minister, saying, today we have an opportunity to rebuild and expand the land of Israel. This is our final opportunity. All of this big rally going on in Jerusalem, apparently, all these fiery statements of Israeli intention from ministers of the current Israeli cabinet, resisting all pressure and proposals to scale down military operations in Gaza. On the contrary, they're calling for the conquest and annexation of Gaza into Israel and the displacement of the population there. And it doesn't seem as if Prime Minister Netanyahu is in a position to hold them back. So, a crisis for the United States in the Middle East. Is it realistic to suppose that the United States is in any sort of position to send expeditionary forces to Ukraine to take on the Russians? The only solution to this problem, which can preserve American and Western face, is peace talks. But of course, about that, that's the Ukrainian problem. But of course, about that, there is no word. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. You can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star. Links under this video. You can check out our shop You'll find there all the various things that we have in the shop: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. Last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.